Hey y'all! Welcome to my channel. It's your girl Sunny here, and do I have a wild story for you today? We're talking about a man who managed to fool not one, not two, but three entire world powers with just one elaborate lie. His name was George Salmanazar, and honey, this story is gonna have you questioning everything you think you know about truth, deception, and just how gullible people can be. So grab your sweet tea, settle in, and let me tell you about the most audacious con man in European history. Now, before we get started, I need to set the scene for y'all. We're talking about the early 1700s in Europe. This was a time when most folks had never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born, and the internet wasn't exactly a thing, if you know what I mean. Information traveled slow as molasses, and if someone showed up claiming to be from some exotic, faraway land, well, people were mighty curious and not too good at fact checking. Enter our main character, a man who would eventually call himself George Salmanazar. Now, here's the thing, we don't actually know his real name. Can you believe that? This man was such a master of deception that even today, historians can't figure out who he really was. What we do know is that he was probably French, born sometime around 1679, and boy oh boy did he have some serious storytelling skills. So picture this. It's around 1702, and this young man shows up in London claiming to be from a place called Formosa. That's what Taiwan used to be called back then. Now, at this time, hardly anybody in Europe knew anything about Formosa, except that it existed somewhere in the Far East. It was like the perfect setup for a con, because who was gonna call him out? Nobody had ever been there. But Salmanazar didn't just claim to be from Formosa. Oh no, honey, he went all out. He said he was a former pagan who had been converted to Christianity by a Jesuit missionary. He had this whole elaborate backstory about his homeland, complete with descriptions of the culture, the religion, the language, and even the food they ate. And let me tell you, the details this man came up with were absolutely incredible. He claimed that Formosan men walked around completely naked except for a gold or silver plate covering their, private parts. He said they lived in underground cities and that they practiced human sacrifice, including sacrificing thousands of young boys every year to their gods. Can you imagine? Thousands. But here's where it gets really interesting. He didn't just tell these stories, he wrote them down. In 1704, he published a book called An Historical and Geographical Description of Formosa. This wasn't just some little pamphlet, y'all. This was a full-blown, detailed account that was over 300 pages long. In this book, he described everything you could possibly want to know about his made-up version of Formosa. He talked about their government, their military, their architecture, their food, their customs, and their religion. He even included what he claimed was the Formosan alphabet and language, complete with a translation of the Lord's Prayer and the Ten Commandments. Now, you might be thinking, Sonny, surely people figured out this was all made up, right? Wrong. The book became a bestseller. People in England, France, and the Netherlands were absolutely fascinated. The Royal Society of London, the same fancy scientific organization that Isaac Newton was president of, they invited Salmanazar to give lectures about Formosa. The Church of England was particularly interested because, remember, he claimed to be a converted Christian. They saw him as proof that Christianity was spreading to the far corners of the world. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself supported Salmanazar, and the church even paid for him to study at Oxford University so he could become a missionary. Can you believe that? Oxford University, one of the most prestigious schools in the world, and they're paying for this con man to get an education based on his completely made-up story. But here's what really gets me. Salmanazar was committed to this lie like nobody's business. When people asked him questions about Formosa, he never broke character. He had answers for everything. When scholars asked him about the language, He would speak in his invented Formosan tongue. When they asked about customs, he had detailed explanations ready to go. He even went so far as to claim that Formosans had a unique way of sleeping, standing up, leaning against walls. And when people asked him to demonstrate, he would actually do it. The man would stand against a wall all night just to maintain his story. That is some serious dedication to a lie, y'all. One of the most outrageous claims in his book was about Formosan cuisine. He said that his people regularly ate raw meat, including human flesh. When pressed about this in London, he actually started eating raw meat in public to prove his point. Can you imagine sitting down to dinner with this man? For several years, Salmanazar was the toast of London society. He was invited to dinner parties, he gave lectures, he met with important religious leaders, and he was treated like a celebrity. Everyone wanted to meet the exotic man from Formosa. But you know what they say, all good things must come to an end, and eventually, cracks started to show in Salmanazar's story. The first major problem came when real missionaries and travelers who had actually been to the Far East started questioning his claims. A French missionary named Father Fontenay, who had spent time in China and knew about the real Formosa, pointed out that many of Salmanazar's descriptions didn't match reality at all. Other scholars started noticing inconsistencies too. For example, Salmanazar claimed that Formosa was located much further south than it actually was, placing it in a tropical climate to explain some of his more outlandish cultural claims. But the biggest red flag? His appearance. Salmanazar claimed to be from a tropical island, but he was pale as could be, even paler than most Europeans. When people questioned this, he had a ready explanation. He said that in Formosa, the upper classes lived underground to protect their skin from the sun. The man had an answer for everything. The final nail in the coffin came when genuine information about the real Formosa started making its way to Europe. As trade routes opened up and more missionaries and merchants traveled to East Asia, it became clear that the real Formosa, Taiwan, was nothing like what Salmanazar had described. By around 1706, the jig was pretty much up. Scholar and religious leaders were starting to openly question his claims, and Salmanazar found himself in an increasingly difficult position. But here's what's really remarkable about this story. Instead of just disappearing or continuing to double down on his lies, Salmanazar eventually did something almost unheard of for a con man of his caliber. He came clean. In 1706, after what he later described as a religious awakening, Salmanazar began confessing his fraud. First, he told close friends privately, and then he gradually admitted to the general public that the whole thing had been an elaborate hoax. He confessed that he had never been to Formosa, that he wasn't from there, and that everything in his famous book had been completely made up. Now, this wasn't some dramatic public confession where he stood up and announced to the world that he'd been lying all along. Instead, it was more gradual. He just quietly stopped claiming to be Formosan, and when pressed, he would admit it had all been made up. The public, for the most part, just seemed to lose interest and move on to the next fascinating thing. After his confession in 1706, Salmanazar completely reinvented himself. He settled down in London and spent the next 57 years of his life working as a legitimate writer, editor, and scholar. He wrote religious works, contributed to various publications, and even worked on translating parts of the Bible. He became friends with famous writer Samuel Johnson and was well respected in London's literary circles. What's remarkable is that after confessing to one of the most elaborate hoaxes in history, he managed to build a completely new, honest reputation. People seemed to forgive him, or maybe they just admired his talent for storytelling so much that they didn't care about his past deception. This whole saga tells us so much about human nature, y'all. It shows how our desire for the exotic and unknown can make us surprisingly gullible. It also shows how powerful a good story can be, especially when it's told by someone who's committed to selling it. Salmanazar's story also highlights how different the world was in the early 1700s. Without modern communication, travel, or fact checking abilities, it was much easier for someone to create an entirely fictional identity and maintain it for years. But maybe the most interesting part of this whole story is what happened after Salmanazar stopped being Formosan. Instead of disappearing in shame after his confession, he managed to reinvent himself as a legitimate scholar and writer. He spent decades contributing to various literary and religious projects, and by many accounts, he was well respected in London intellectual circles despite his past as a hoaxer. Some historians think that his later legitimate work was actually his way of making amends for his earlier deception. It's like he was trying to balance out the lies with genuine scholarship and truth. And you know what? It seems like it worked. He lived a long, productive life and died respected in 1763, over 50 years after confessing to his elaborate fraud. So there you have it, y'all. The incredible story of George Salmanazar, the man who convinced three world powers that he was from a land of underground cities, human sacrifice, and naked gold-plated men. It's a story that's part con game, part performance art, and part commentary on human nature itself. What I find most fascinating is that, in a weird way, Salmanazar's fake Formosa became real in the minds of thousands of people. His book was translated into multiple languages, and his version of Formosan culture influenced European ideas about East Asia for decades. Sometimes fiction can become so powerful that it takes on a life of its own. This story makes me wonder, in our age of social media and instant information, could someone pull off a deception like this today? On one hand, we have better fact-checking and communication, but on the other hand, we also have deep fakes, Photoshop, and echo chambers where false information can spread like wildfire. What do y'all think? Could a modern-day Salmanazar fool the world today? And more importantly, what does this story teach us about how we evaluate the information we receive? If you enjoyed this wild historical tale, make sure to smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, because I've got so many more incredible stories from history that I can't wait to share with you. Drop a comment below and let me know, what's the most elaborate lie you've ever heard someone tell? Have you ever been completely fooled by something that seemed too good to be true? I love reading your responses, and who knows, your story might inspire my next video. Thanks for watching, y'all, and I'll see you in the next one.